So, with that being said, again, welcome to today's session, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Erica.
Great. Thank you so much, Jason. I'd like to welcome everybody. Welcome to Advocacy by the Book, Ins and Outs of Fiscal Sponsorship. My name is Erica Spangler-Raz, and I use she, her pronouns. I am Senior Counsel and Director of Pro Bono Works for Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. Chicago Lawyers Committee works to secure racial equity and economic opportunity for all. We envision a future where all residents, regardless of race, gender, socioeconomic background, have equal access to jobs, homes, education, and opportunity. We provide legal support through partnerships with the private bar and collaborate with community-based groups to craft and implement community-based solutions that advance civil rights. We use the full range of legal tools: impact litigation, direct services litigation, policy advocacy, non-litigation legal assistance to mission-aligned organizations, and community education programs like this one to advance our mission. You can learn more about our work and to request legal support for your organization by visiting our website at www.clccrul.org, and we will put that in the chat. So for today's session, the convergence of COVID-19 and heightened public awareness of police brutality and deeply entrenched systems of racism created opportunities for many new or smaller organizations to build capacity and strengthen their advocacy. But it also comes with growing challenges. This seminar on legal issues of fiscal sponsorship is the second in our Advocacy by the Book series. The purpose of these webinars is to provide information to help leaders in community-based organizations better understand and manage legal, financial, and operational issues. Today, we're looking forward to learning about fiscal sponsorship, including the IRS requirements and practical considerations about control and decision-making, insurance, employees, and financial reporting. We'll also learn about when it makes sense to formalize the legal structure and apply for income tax exemption. Thank you to the Woods Fund, Conant Family Foundation, and the Field Foundation for supporting this educational series, and to our pro bono partner, Chapman & Cutler, for co-sponsoring this session on fiscal sponsorship. Our format today is a brief legal presentation and then a case study with Transformative Justice Law Project of Illinois. That will cover the first 55 minutes, and then we'll have some Q&A sessions where you can ask any questions of our legal experts and questions of Alexia Rice-Henry from as our nonprofit leader that's navigating these issues. So today we're joined by Rebecca Wallenfels and Paul Carmen with Chapman & Cutler. Rebecca is a partner in Chapman & Cutler's Trusted Estates Department. She has extensive tax-exempt organization experience representing charitably inclined clients, including private foundations. Rebecca also serves as the firm's pro bono partner and manages the volunteer efforts of Chapman attorneys. Paul Carmen is the partner and practice group leader of Chapman's tax department, and he has extensive experience representing tax-exempt entities in a wide variety of transactional tax issues, including drafting, negotiating, and terminating fiscal sponsorship relationships on behalf of fiscal sponsors and fiscally sponsored groups, many of our pro bono clients. So Rebecca and Paul are my go-tos for pro bono clients needing help with fiscal sponsors. Thank you so much, Rebecca and Paul.
Thank you, Erica.
Thank you. I think we should skip to the second slide, or the third slide, number 2, the next one. Thank you. So fiscal sponsorships are a normal part of a growth cycle of organizations. It's having a bunch of people who have a good idea to do something good for the world. No, one back, thank you. Is a nice place to, is a normal place to start. But then doing good sometimes is expensive, so it is necessary to go out and get other people's money to help you to do good. And that's where this fiscal sponsorship comes in, because if you go to a charitable organization and ask for money, or you go to a government to ask for money, you go to a private foundation and ask for money, they're all going to ask questions, and they're all going to have conditions as to when they will be willing to give you money. So go to the next slide. We'll come back to this slide several times during the presentation, but this is a good way to organize your thinking about fiscal sponsorships. There's three basic stages of fiscal sponsorships. The first stage, the project is part of the sponsor. The second stage, the project is an independent entity that is not yet recognized as a tax-exempt entity. And in the third stage, the project is an independent tax-exempt entity. So go to the next slide. One back. Yeah. In the first two stages, contributions are made by the public or private foundations or governmental entities to the sponsoring entity. And the reason for that is that most times when public gives donations to charitable organizations, they're expecting a charitable contribution deduction. And so by giving to the sponsoring organization, they're able to get a charitable contribution deduction. In stage three, the sponsored entity, the project, has its own exempt status. So contributions can go directly to the sponsored entity. And there, the sponsoring entity is just generally providing back office services, sometimes sage advice, but mostly back office. It is also important to realize at this point that there's this stage 1.5, which is sort of a blend between stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 1.5, the sponsoring entity forms an LLC that is wholly owned by the sponsoring entity, and the project is run inside the LLC. And as you'll see as we talk about the details, that has some characteristics of being an independent entity and some characteristics of being a stage 1 controlled project. Go to the next slide. Rebecca, I think that's yours.
So I'm going to get into the details a little bit about what it means to be a stage 1, because this is where a lot of plans start, right? You have a project, you have a plan, you have a community service, you have an idea yourself that you want to do, or even sometimes an existing non-for-profit or an existing 501c3, right? That's our tax exempt code status for an organization that's got its tax exempt status from the IRS. They have a project they want to run and operate, but it's maybe a little bit independent from the purposes of the organization. And so the idea with this is that the project is going to be up and running, maybe run by individuals, but the project itself is not tax exempt, especially if you're coming to, with an idea or a community event or service you want to do, but you're not organized yet into either a separate legal entity or but you nevertheless need to get funding, and that's usually the key. I mean, Paul kind of hit the nail on the head here, and I know Erica mentioned it here. As these things need to grow and attract dollars, when you're going to apply for grants, when you're going to want corporate sponsors, you want to even find individual donors, right? It helps to not only qualify for those grants, qualify for those dollars, but to do your solicitation if you have tax exempt status, so that not only do they get the donation, but then you're also qualified usually for more grants. So in this case, the project partners with an existing tax exempt organization, right? Our sponsor. And they form, that partnership and that relationship with that. But really, if we go back to our slide here, that is our sort of key visual we're going to go back to here in our first column, the column here on the left, right? The idea is the project is really sort of a subset of the sponsor, right? It means the sponsor is wholly responsible for what happens, and all the donor dollars, meaning all those grant dollars, all those donations, all the funds collected are going to the sponsor, right? And then the sponsor is essentially handing out the funds for the project itself. So in this stage one, the project, as we like to call it, doesn't have a separate legal entity. There's not necessarily a formality unless we're going to go to that stage 1.5, which Paul mentioned. But everything is running through the sponsor organization. But it is usually where a lot of projects start out with this format. So if that's where you are in your stage, think about that. But think about this too. If you had not done fiscal sponsorship, that this is a way, right, of maybe garnering financing through grant applications, through fundraising, through solicitations, for that. When you create this kind of relationship with an existing 501c3, an existing tax-exempt organization, but know that sponsoring organization then is really responsible for what happens with this project. And we'll go over some of those other things, but that's kind of the brief overview of a stage one. And we touched briefly about stage 1.5, right? This is a little bit of a hybrid between 1 and 2. And here, it's still the same idea and concept. We still have a project. It's wholly owned and by our sponsoring organization. But in this case, we're actually going to create a legal entity for the project, right? And generally, it's an LLC, because an LLC is just a wholly owned subsidiary. So we're getting into our corporate structure, right? We're borrowing from the for-profit world. So you have an LLC that's created. The LLC is a non-for-profit. But the LLC, and the key on this is, it's actually the sponsoring organization that creates the LLC, right? So if you have an independent project you are doing and you're forming your relationship with a sponsoring organization, the sponsor is the one who creates the organization. And what this does is it has the benefit of creating at least a structural wrapper around the project. And among the things it can do then is the LLC gets its own tax ID number. It can open up bank accounts. It can have employees itself, separate and apart from the sponsor. Because if we go back to, like our wholly owned, our favorite slide here, really the project, its employees, its funds, everything is really a subsidiary of the sponsor, right? That's here for one. So the sponsor is responsible for all of this, using the sponsor's tax ID number, you're using the sponsor's account, the sponsor is doing all the reporting, etc. If you're doing a little bit of a hybrid, that 1.1, you're getting a little bit into what's stage 2, and we'll touch on what is stage 2 here on there. But stage 2 is where we actually create an independent entity. But we're not tax exempt yet, right? Because becoming tax exempt is a process, right? Even once you create a legal structure, if you have a project, it can take some money. You got to do a 1023 application to the IRS, and there's a fee associated with that, let alone the time it takes to prepare that return. Registration with the Illinois Attorney General's office. So there is, there's steps and often funds involved with getting tax exempt status so that you can accept those donations. So with stage 2, you do have that same thing where you are creating a separate legal entity, a non-for-profit. That non-for-profit does have and must have its own board, its own officers, right? It's an entity, it's a thing. It's got its own tax ID number too. It can have then its own employees. But until that organization, that non-for-profit, goes through the process of doing the 1023, getting its tax exempt status with the IRS, doing its registration with the Illinois Attorney General's office, right? It's going to be limited in terms of the grants it can apply for, in terms of the donor dollars it can and will attract. So it's still going to do much like with stage 1. Go back here, going to create that relationship with the sponsor. Here, this is our middle column. But again, all the donor dollars are flowing into the sponsor. And then the sponsor is releasing the funds to the project entity in order to fund the project. So that's our sort of legal structure. And then Paul, do you want to just take us through stage 3? You're on, I think, Paul, you're on mute.
Okay. Stage 3 is the project is really all grown up. I like to think of the analogy of the project being a high school student, and the parents are trying to encourage the high school student to allow the high school student independence, and eventually they want the high school student out the door. And stage 3 is out the door. But they go to college, they still want your money. And so stage 3 is the sponsoring organization providing support, but now it's generally in the form of services. They provide back office services, often payroll, accounting, reporting. And so the sponsoring organization is there to make sure that the project entity is able to succeed. Most new tax-exempt organizations wind up within 2 to 3 years. So with a sponsoring organization providing back office services, the chances of success are much better. Okay. We didn't go into the bank accounts in stage 1 or 2, but in stage 1, all the bank accounts are in the sponsoring organization's name. In stage 2, there's going to be 2 sets of bank accounts, one for the sponsoring organization and one's for the project entity. In stage 3, the bank accounts for the project are in the project's name. Now, the sponsoring organization may have access to them because they have to do reporting, and sometimes they do payroll. But they're in the sponsoring, the project entity's name, the project entity's EIN, and so the project entity owns those accounts. The type, if we go on to slide 12, the types of services that are sometimes provided in stage 3 are listed here. I don't need to read them. Yeah, I think you can read them, but it's a wide variety of services. Basically anything that in terms of back office organizational structure that a new organization might need assistance with, the sponsoring organization can provide. Let's see. There is a question as to the relationship at this point. Providing management services, providing administrative services from one charitable organization to another is not necessarily a charitable service in itself. So there is, I have seen organizations who do basically, this is a business, and they charge market rates, and strictly speaking, if you're charging market rates and you're competing with for-profit businesses and providing the same services of for-profit services, it should be unrelated trade or business income to the sponsoring organization. Now, the IRS will not treat it as unrelated trade or business income if the costs are either are below market and just cover the expenses, or below the cost of providing the expenses. Okay, we're at the next section now. We sort of flipped the order. Are you handling this, or am I?
Happy to kick this off, Paul. And yeah, I'll just tap on you to do this. When I'm done talking, I'll okay. Tap. Okay. So the next topic we want to get into, because we want to give you an overview of the rules regarding political activity of organizations, and then wrap that into sponsorship, right? Because one of the keys of fiscal sponsorship, right? Remember, our sponsoring organization, especially when you're in stage 1, 1.5, or 2, has a lot of responsibility and reporting obligations for what the project is doing. So if you're coming and if you're either having the project and you're, a key person in the project, it's helpful to know these rules. And if you are part of a sponsoring organization that is providing kind of the funding for a project, it's good to know these rules too, because you got oversight, you have this responsibility, and you got to make sure none of these rules are being violated. And here the rules we're really talking about are federal tax rules, right? When you become, so remember, our sponsoring organization is going to be a 501c3 tax exempt entity. But when they fund the projects, whether it's just a project that's a loose organization, a project that's an actual entity, or forms a relationship, i.e. stage 2, where we have another legal entity over here that's not tax exempt, the rules of the sponsorship and the rules of the funds collected per the sponsorship have got to fit all of this within charitable activities, right? Because our 501c3 is a charitable organization. And as such, to maintain its status as a 501c3, it can only engage in religious, charitable, scientific, testing for public safety, literary, or educational activity, right? What is not permitted, and a big not behind this, big no, is for any direct or indirect participation, intervention in a political campaign on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for office, right? So this is what we call, these are the sort of the anti-campaigning laws that are part of the tax code when it comes to 501c3s, right? So if it's got an organization that's registered as a 501c3, it can't do that. Now, there are other tax code exemptions for organizations that engage in political activity, that engage in this campaigning. That's a different tax code section. And they have different tax rules and laws that applies. But here we're talking specifically about, we're going to form our relationship with a 501c3, right? And we want to do that because 501c3s are the organizations that are charities and whose donations qualify for tax exemption or tax deductions for individual donors, for corporations. And there are also a lot of, again, government grants, other public charity grants, grants from private foundations. You're required to be a 501c3 in order to qualify for those grants and those funds. So we need to maintain that 501c3 status. That's just a big picture overview. When it comes to campaigning, here's our tax law rule about what's permitted and what's not permitted. So with that, I did the easy part. Paul, I'm going to have you take us through the next part and go a little bit into the intricacies of what it means or does not mean to do campaigning.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of organizations get inspired because they see a need and they see something that needs to be changed, and that's great. That's doing good. What is necessary to affect that change may determine what type of organization you form and how you have to proceed. Yeah, as Rebecca said, that 501c3s, there's just a flat out prohibition on direct campaigning for or against. Now, the or against was added in 1987. So I grew up during a time when the or against wasn't there. And you would see churches, you would see charitable organizations out on the street leading marches during elections. But they would be campaigning against a candidate. Of course, we have a two-party system, so when you campaign against somebody, you're essentially campaigning for the other person. But Congress clarified that in 1987, so you can't do for or against now. The trickier part is lobbying. Now, our marketing department put a big X in it, blue no there, and that's an overstatement. It's no more than an insubstantial portion of the activities may be lobbying. But in fairness to my marketing department, this is the X and the no may well be close to what the IRS thinks of the permissive standard. There is an election that is available, a 501H election, that allows you to use a formula based upon how much your gross receipts are to determine the level of the activities of lobbying activities that are permitted. If you don't make the 10H election, then you're under common law and there's no clear definition. And people take their choices as to whether they'd rather be under the no clear definition or under the formula. Let's go on to the next slide. The last presidential election was a good example of a situation where if you had an organization that came up and said, healthcare for all. I mean, advocating for healthcare for all is certainly fine, sounds charitable, but during an election, it was, one candidate was for and one candidate was against. And so it would have been a clear statement in support of one candidate against the other candidate. You can identify a candidate by not necessarily using their name. If you made reference to someone who formerly ran a casino, everyone would know who you meant. So you indirect references are just as bad in terms of campaign intervention as direct references. Let's go on to the next slide. Voter education. This is one of those things that is really good if you do it well, but it's easy to get into trouble. I know several organizations that run public forums, and they invite, in order to do it right, you have to invite candidates from all the parties and not have it basically be an attack session for one group. You have to allow both perspectives, both parties to present their point of view. And if you're doing a voter education guide, again, it needs to be balanced in order to do it right. And I know that, in the United States, there's a selective enforcement system, and some organizations think they'll never be touched. And that may be true in some instances, depending upon the political strength of the organization. But for a smaller organization getting started, you don't have the same type of resistance to enforcement activity that a larger organization that has been established for a number of years does have. Voter registration, same concept. It's fine to do so long as you do it on a nonpartisan basis. If you only target neighborhoods that are known to vote one way, then you are going to run into problems. If you target geographic areas that are cross-party, then it's fine. On to the next slide. During campaigns, particularly bitter campaigns, it's difficult to control all the officers and directors, employees of an organization. You don't have to control them completely. They can express their own opinion. That is perfectly fine. but they can't express an opinion representing the organization in reference to the campaign. And that's a delicate balance. When an officer, director, employee expresses an opinion, it can't be at a forum or publication of the organization. When you have a fiscal sponsorship, so that you have a project in addition to the main group of the organization, that adds another layer, because the people in this project during stage one are part of the organization and subject to the same restraints. In stage two, it's a question of what is budgeted, and is the project organization using money that was budgeted for something else in a way that is not permitted. Okay, on to the next slide.
All right, I will take over to talk about lobbying. So lobbying, as Paul had mentioned, is, well, first let's define what lobbying means. And we're going to use kind of that term. But basically, the way the tax code defines it is, it's a direct or indirect attempt to influence legislation, right? It is by contacting legislatures or urging the public to contact legislatures, doing something to propose, support, or oppose any legislation or bill. And in general, we go back to, our generic slide here. Let's go back here, where there was I missed one here, where the key is like no more than an insubstantial amount of the activities may be related to lobbying. So where campaigning, the tax code says, no, you can't do it directly or indirectly. Lobbying is, you can only do a little bit, right? So let's talk about, so first it's helpful to understand what is lobbying, and then let's talk about, what is a little bit. And to Paul's point about, there is a tax code election that can be made that gives us a formula for what does a little bit mean. Or you can not make that election. So first, going back to the other slides, what is lobbying, right? It's this idea that we want to influence some legislation, either legislation that's not on the books, legislation that is being proposed and we're for it or against it. And it can be the organization itself, its employees are contacting legislatures or the legislative aides or someone within the legislative body about the legislation, or you're encouraging the public to do this. Now, this is a subtle note, right? Remember, like, our tax code prohibits this when it comes to the legislative body, right? But here in the US, right, we've got other government branches. We got the executive branch and we got administrative agencies that may be enforcing the rules. It's okay to contact them. Like, this is not a prohibition on them. But in terms of legislatures, that's where we get into actual lobbying, right? And that's the part that is prohibited, or you can only engage in a significant amount, right? And so, right, we get one here, an example, the DACA rules, right? And so we had people lobbying to defend that or not, but you also had the enforcement or not of those rules. So with this, before I want to touch one point on, Paul had talked about an election that can be made under 501H. I get my tax code section is correct, right? And the benefit of that is it gives a specific formula for how much of your activities, right? And it's just basically taking a look at gross receipts. And I think we had, right, these are, hang on, somewhere in here, I think we do. I apologize for the slides. We might get to it, but there's a formula that basically is looking at your gross revenue and then your expenditures and providing the math for how much of the activities you can expend on essentially lobbying expenditures. And if you fall within that formula, then you're okay. You know, you're okay. If you don't make the election, you still have to do the reporting, right? Because so, and we're talking in the context of a fiscal sponsorship, usually our sponsoring organizations, they're filing a 990, they have to report, the activities of the project, the funds spent on the project, and you have to still disclose any lobbying type activities and the expenditure of funds. And so if you're not making that tax election with the formula, then it just becomes a disclosure, and then you're taking the position that, but this is just not an insignificant, this is an insignificant amount of expenditures for that. One of the things that I do want to touch on is that for private foundations are subject to some very specific rules when it comes to both campaigning and lobbying expenditures. And this is relevant to know either if one, your sponsoring organization is itself a private foundation, or if you are looking to get grants from private foundations, right? They are subject to even stricter rules on this topic, right? And, for those of you who are not as familiar with what a private foundation is, typically private foundations meet that definition because the donations into the private foundations came from a single person or a small group of people, and that's a substantial part of what their revenue, their assets come from, as opposed to what we call a public charity, which is usually, the other one, where their donations are coming from the general public, right? Private foundations is usually their funding is coming from a small group of donors, or maybe a single family or individual donor. And so the tax code tends to impose some stricter requirements on them, because usually a lot of times those donors then are also the ones running the private foundation and making the decisions. So they have some stricter rules. And among the stricter rules are just is they have excise taxes they have to pay when the private foundation makes anything that's called a taxable expenditure, right? So I'm going to be a little legalese here. But this is significant to them, because they want to avoid something being called a taxable expenditure. Because the moment they make a donation, and again, if they're making a donation to the project or to the sponsor, and those funds and any part of them can be used for elections or for lobbying, the private foundation itself can get into trouble. Not only can it get into trouble, but oftentimes the sponsor is also the one who ultimately ends up getting into trouble, because a private foundation usually has prohibitions, like can have an absolute bar on some of these things, right? So while there are certain exceptions for like voter registration drives and certain, again, those voter education rules, it's not uncommon sometimes for a private foundation in their grant making to just have a straight bar and prohibition on doing this. So you have to be careful in doing any grant application and in looking at the requirements for that, because the sponsor doesn't want to accept those dollars if they're not sure that they're going to comply with the private foundation's donations. But some of them do. And so some of them will have maybe an exception where they do that. But so there are some exceptions about what's not a taxable expenditure. And here's one of those rules for that. And again, if when it comes to lobbying, again, because certain amount of de minimis lobbying is permitted, is that it still won't affect a grant from a private foundation, so long as the grant you're getting is not earmarked to go to the lobbying, right? The influencing legislation, and there isn't actually an agreement you have with the private foundation who's doing the grant that the funds are going to be used to influence legislation. So again, private foundations, just because they have stricter rules, some of them will actually want to prohibit, just because it makes their lives a little easier. They'll have a prohibition on their grants to have any of their money used for lobbying, or any of it certainly going for anything campaigning. All right, so Paul, final thoughts on political activity of the sponsored group?
Yeah. The greatest challenge on both for stages 1 and stage 2 is where the record keeping. Going back to my analogy to a high school student, you know, that the parent makes a safe environment for the high school student, but the high school student wants independence. And if you've ever had a high school student and asked them what they were doing, you probably didn't get much useful information. And this is some very similar relationship between the sponsored organization, the sponsored project, and the sponsoring organization. There needs to be a clear flow of information in order for the sponsoring organization to make it the reports that are necessary. Going back to slide 28 now. Next slide. Okay, this should look familiar by now. In the first, on the left-hand side, we have the stage 1. The project entity is a branch of the sponsoring organization. So all of the activities of the project entity are the activities of the sponsoring organization. So when we were talking about no campaign intervention, an insubstantial amount of lobbying, the sponsoring organization has to include the activities of the project in determining whether or not it has made any campaign intervention, whether or not it has an insubstantial portion of lobbying. And in order to include those in the calculation, it has to have information from the project. In stage 2, in the middle, the sponsoring organization is more remote, but the sponsoring organization is going to be providing money for the project entity to do stuff. And hopefully the sponsoring organization has asked for a budget, and the budget is itemized. And on that budget, hopefully there will not be any campaign intervention and only an insubstantial portion of lobbying. So in that case, since the sponsoring organization is providing the money to fund the activities of the project entity, it again has to include it on its reports. In the third column, this is when the high school kid has gone to college. So what the high school kid does is it's on it, but if the sponsoring organization has agreed contractually to do reporting, it still needs to know the information. Okay, I think we already covered slide 29. And that would take us to employment issues.
All right, so I get to talk about employment issues. And this becomes very important because you want to understand whenever we form a fiscal sponsorship and what stage you are in, who is going to be the employer or who's making employment decisions, and whether anyone who's working for the project, are they actually an employee? And I'm using the term employee as in a legal sense versus an independent contractor, because the type of reporting and the type of payroll taxes you need to follow, those rules, does depend on how they're treated. With that, let's see, oops, sorry, I'm going to go back to, our favorite slide right here. stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, right? You guys are going to get sick of this slide by the end of the presentation. But let's start right with stage 1 all the way over here on the left-hand side. In stage 1, really, our project doesn't have a separate legal existence. It's wholly a part of the sponsor, which means it's a practical purpose, right? You can probably always tell anyone who's an employee or an independent contractor, right? You're working for the sponsor, right? That is the employer. That's the hirer. Even if you think of it as separate and you got a separate structure, but that means then the sponsor is the one who is going to be concerned about the employment issues. And usually the employment issues come down to this question about, for anyone who is working and being paid, you can have volunteers, that's awesome. We all love volunteers. But the moment you're going to pay someone compensation, the question that has to be asked is, are they an employee? And by employee, I mean the legal definition of employee or the tax code definition of employee, or an independent contractor, right? It's a big legal distinction that's made. And the reason why we make that distinction, we have to know who to treat what, is because what they have to do and how they have to do the tax reporting and the withholding and doing the payroll taxes are very different under those two rules, right? And it's the difference for anyone here who's ever gotten a W-2 versus a 1099, right? That's really the heart of that difference between whether you're an employee, employees get W-2s, if you're an independent contractor, you get a 1099. But in a stage 1, right, everything is the sponsor's responsibility, and anyone who's an employee or an independent contractor is working for the sponsor, right? And so the sponsor is the one who makes this legal determination on behalf of anyone who's working on the project and getting paid from project dollars. In stage 2, here again, our project has a separate legal entity and existence. And the same would be true, by the way, for our, remember, stage 1.5, which is a little bit of a hybrid, because at stage 1.5, we have a separate legal entity that's formed by the sponsor. So it's ultimately, the sponsor is like the parent company of our subsidiary. But the moment I create that separate legal entity in stage 1.5, or here in stage 2, where I have a project entity, that entity can be the employer or hirer, right? It can have its own people who work for it because it's now a separate legal entity and structure. So it can, hire people or pay contractors. But then it has the responsibility to make that determination about whether someone is an independent contractor or an employee. And you still have, especially with stage 1.5 and then stage 2, of if someone is doing work for the project entity, is to make sure you're defining, are they who they're being contracted to do work for? Is it the project entity or is it the sponsor, right? Because depending on what you're going to do will depend that. You may have people who are existing volunteers, employees, or contractors for the sponsor who are going to be working on the project. And so this is why it's important to have a contract for your fiscal sponsorship between the sponsor and your project entity and your project right here, right? So we can define like who's the quote employer or hirer for anyone who is getting paid from project entity dollars, and what that arrangement is going to be. And then the last, usually the project entity, they're exempt. Generally speaking, in that one, usually anyone who's working for the project, it ends up being hired by the project entity, because all the sponsors usually doing is providing certain back office support, as Paul had indicated in that laundry list of things. And they'll have their employees or contractors doing some of the work for them. But that's usually determined by that relationship of what they're doing. But there's usually a lot more clarity about who's working for what entity. Okay, so with that, we kind of already touched base on what it means, what employment issues are and how they're different in stage 1, 2, and 3 for that. And there's 1.5. So what, yeah, Is there anything here I missed, or Paul, anything here you wanted to add just on the overview? We'll get into some of the practical issues and then some of the other legal definitional issues of the difference between employee and independent contractor, but that's sort of like the big picture about employment in the different stages.
I think you covered it. Okay. One of the things that, you know, when you're starting out a new project and you want to do good and you're getting a bunch of people together that all want to do good and you're excited about it, you don't necessarily want to think about the bad things that can happen if you screw up.
That's what the lawyer's here for.
Okay, so when we talk about legal considerations for political activities, some bad things can happen both to the organization and to the individuals involved. First of all, there's an excise tax on excess lobbying expenditures. If you spend too much on lobbying, you can lose your exempt status, and you can have an excise tax. Now, if you think about the reason for the fiscal sponsorship is that you have a group of people who don't have exempt status, who are wanting to use the exempt status of another organization to support them, but the whole relationship becomes meaningless if the activities of the project causes this sponsoring organization to lose its exempt status. So corporate income tax and a 5% excise tax, and if the problem is not corrected, and by correction, the IRS usually means that the organization gets the money back, and the money back from, you know, who's going to give you the money back is a very difficult question. And there's not necessarily someone to get it back from, but if the problem is not corrected, then the excise tax can go up to 100% of the expenditure. So not only has the organization lost its exempt status, paid income tax, paid an excise tax, and it's 5% excise tax, now it's paying 100% excise tax. Oh, and I didn't mention the excise tax on the managers. So the officers and directors who agreed to the expenditures individually out of their own pockets are liable for a 5% excise tax. And if it's not corrected, it can go up to 50%. So that's enough to raise a few eyebrows. And it often gets people's attention because the sponsoring organization and the managers individually do not want to be subject to those excise taxes. Okay. If too much activity is undertaken, you may be required to register, have the individuals and the organization register as lobbyists. That's not my area of practice, so I can't tell you the requirements for that, but I have seen some organizations become required because of the level of their activities. Some organizations form a 501c4 that is parallel to the 501c3, and the 501c4s are allowed to do more political activities, but contributions to a 501c4 are not deductible. So you can't take private foundation money in the C4, and if you take money from the public, you need to tell them that it's not deductible. All right. So on to the next slide. We talked a little bit the 501H election before. If you make the election, you're required to give more detail about your expenditures. And again, for the sponsoring organization, this detail includes the detail from the project. So there has to be information flow from the project up to the sponsoring organization in order for the sponsoring organization to file its 990. And to the extent that contributions into the sponsoring organization are for lobbying expenditures, then they won't be deductible, and that needs to be disclosed to donors. The next slide.
All right, employment issues. And remember, I had to emphasize this idea, this definition about who is an independent contractor versus who is an employee, right? Because this becomes a very important distinction to make. A number of organizations, they like to have independent contractors because the reporting for that tends to be easier. You pay them, you issue them a 1099 for the amount paid, and you're pretty much done, right? Simple, straightforward, easy. Versus an employee. If someone is an employee, one, you have to pay payroll taxes, and under the tax code, the employer pays half of those payroll taxes and the employee pays the other half of the payroll taxes. So you got payroll taxes to do. Often on the state level, you also have unemployment insurance that is required. And then you have to do withholding. So you have to collect the data from the person to do mandatory tax withholding on compensation, and then make sure you're making those payroll payments to the federal government, to the state of Illinois, or wherever state you're in. So there's a lot more work that's involved with someone being an employee, a lot more rules and regulations you have to follow if someone is an employee, not to mention all the other employment related issues, Family Medical Leave Act and all that comes up with an employee. So this distinction gets to be very important. But what it really comes down to from a purely legal matter in terms of is someone an independent contractor, is an employee, really comes down to who controls the means and method about how this person is accomplishing their work, right? So if the project or the sponsor is controlling the time, the place, the manner in terms of which the work is being done, then it's going to be an employee. If it's not, and the person who's performing the work has the flexibility and the decision making about how the work is accomplished, even if if we got a particular end result we're looking for, but how the work is accomplished. And also, one of the factors on there is, like, if I'm a contractor, I'm allowed to get some profit off of the work. So think about this in terms of, I'll give you just an easy kind of example. Let's say I was someone, and this is maybe an absurd example, someone who was maybe medically needy, and I go see my doctor frequently. And it's just my doctor, he's got a solo office, down there. And I go see him like on a daily basis, right? And I spend hours in his office. He's going to be an independent contractor, even if I start, taking up all of his hours in the day, because I am that much of a hypochondriac. I'm going to see him 8 hours in a day, right? Because, part of that is he makes the decisions about, treatment. He makes decisions about, recommendations, all of that. I'm going to see him. Versus, say, if I wanted someone to come and or maybe organize my closet space. So we're going to get into a little bit of a gray area where I'm going to hire someone to come in, but I'm going to sit down there. I'm going to tell them when they show up, how I want my closet organized, what they're going to do. And I let them do that, versus if they just came in and I said, hey, I want my closets organized. And they come in, they say, that's fine. We'll show up on this day at this time. And this is how we're going to make your closet look. And it looks all organized, but they do all the decision. So you sort of see the grading scale that we go down from that in terms of independent contractor versus employee. And here's our little example in this first slide right here. You've got instruction being given want to canvass the Rogers Park area and see what support is for our particular issue, right? Direction is being given. I want particular results, right? Here's an area. I want to know this, but nothing else is being determined, required on there, versus specific direction given, like to be at this location at this time, get the survey packet produced by the organization, going to use the organization's automobile to accomplish this, and then report back as soon as finished, like very detailed, very controlled, right? This smacks much more of an employee. This smacks much more of an independent contractor. So it becomes a fact-based decision, but that gives you kind of an example of that. And among the things, right, we're there, right? An employer is one who can control that. If someone works as your employee, you control their time, the person performing the work, you control their time, their place, the manner of the work being done, where it's being done, when it's being done, any tools or equipment that are being used, who's providing assistance or not, what kind of work they're doing, sequences to be followed. So the more the decisions are being laid out for what this person is doing, the more they're an employee versus they're just saying, hey, I want X done, and I'll pay you Y dollars to get that done, and you let the person go off and do it, right? That's an independent contractor, not necessarily an employee. All right, Paul, do you want to take us through the practical considerations?
I think we're running a little bit behind time, so why don't I just turn it back over to Erica?
Yes. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul. I was just going to say, I think we're going to send all of the slides to everyone because I think there are some really important practical considerations on this. I'm going to bring up a few of them. One is that, Paul, you mentioned initially talking about the trade or business of a potential sponsor being in line with what a for-profit business could do, or basically serving as a fiscal sponsor and providing specific, back office services, being in line with what perhaps a for-profit company could do. Those types of services not being exempt activities specifically. And I think that it's really important, that kind of drives the point of for a new project that's looking for a fiscal sponsor, how important it is to look for an organization that is mission aligned, so that the sponsor can look at furthering the project's initiatives and activities as actually furthering its own mission. So that is something that I think is a really good takeaway from that mission alignment. The other thing that I wanted to mention, and I put this in the chat, is that our first webinar on Advocacy by the Book really goes into depth on the legal and compliance issues for 501c3 and 501c4 issues, and a high level on the lobbying compliance. Again, just a high level, because it's really complicated. And there are federal laws for lobbying, there are state laws for lobbying, there are city ordinances for lobbying. And so it can be a little bit more complex. So I would just recommend watching that first webinar series on that. The reason why we mention this in talking about fiscal sponsorships is that whenever we're talking with a group, whether it's a potential project that's looking for a fiscal sponsor, or engaging in those negotiations, those introductory conversations, or we're talking with a sponsor who's been approached by a group of organizers or a coalition that wants to fiscally sponsor their work, that we really want to understand the perspective of the sponsor and the IRS implications of what those activities are, and why the potential fiscal sponsor may not be willing to negotiate on certain aspects. And so we really do need to have that information flow on what exactly are the activities being conducted, because that could be potential risk for the fiscal sponsor. It could be potential risk for the private foundation if those conversations are not very open and really collaborative on how to advance the work and still be in compliance with the law for everybody's compliance requirements. So that was the second thing. The third thing I wanted to mention is that while we cannot go into this piece today about how to have those conversations and how to do other collaborations, Forefront, the Mission Sustainability Initiative at Forefront, is going to have a seminar on September 30th covering back office collaborative type type of work, and we'll be going into detail about fiscal sponsorship, not necessarily the legal aspects, which is what we're focusing on today. But if you want to learn more about fiscal sponsorship and kind of how to have those conversations, and what the services are, and what the fees are, please do go to myforefront.org and register for their seminar. And so now what I'd like to do before we get into our case study portion, I want to just see if there are any questions for Rebecca and Paul about the legal aspects of fiscal sponsorship. And I'm looking through the chat here. I did have one that was emailed to me before the seminar. So Rebecca and Paul, I'm just going to pose this one to you. And Rebecca, this one may be more for you. And it is, how can we have the employee report to our project steering committee, but be an employee of the fiscal sponsor? Our group is not incorporated.
So so what you want to pay attention to there is just on the reporting, right? So make sure like all your employment contract relationship is with the fiscal sponsor. If you've got a sponsorship agreement, you have the employment terms and provisions spelled out within that agreement. But you can then have someone spend time doing the report and providing the information. The key on that, on being the player, is who's giving the direction and the decision making onto that. So again, usually one of the keys that we always say with every fiscal sponsorship, right? The key on that is going to be communication, right? Because a lot of times the project itself will like to be, the people who are running the project want to be certain key decision makers, but they have to provide information back to the fiscal sponsor. And then the fiscal sponsor, especially if you're in stage 1 or stage 2, is the one who does some of the implementation of that. And so it does require coordination for that. I hope I addressed that question.
I think so. I'm going to look through and scroll through the chat and see if I missed any others. Feel free to put any questions in the chat. I am not saying, there were other questions that I answered more directly on direct messages. So with that, I don't see anything else. I will tell you that anybody who has questions about negotiating fiscal sponsorship agreements, and you're at that point, or perhaps you're in a fiscal sponsorship agreement and you need to understand the terms because perhaps you signed it because it was presented to you by the fiscal sponsor. Any of those questions, please do feel free to reach out to us. Our website, clccrul.org. You can submit an inquiry to request representation. There is a question in the chat. I'm just gonna, and I may put this to Paul. Can you say more about what to do if the group you are sponsoring breaks any of these the IRS rules, and how to hold the sponsoring, how does the sponsor hold that group accountable? And let's assume that you have an agreement in place, and then perhaps is the answer different if you have a sponsorship agreement in place?
Okay. How you hold the organization, the project responsible, or whether you can hold the project responsible, is really determined by the fiscal sponsorship agreement. The fiscal sponsorship agreement should have a provision for reporting use of the funds, and if there is a violation, you provide a budget at the beginning of the year, and then you provide how the funds were actually used at the end of the year. And then if there's a variation between what was approved and what was not approved, if it is off purpose, then the fiscal sponsorship agreement should entitle the sponsor to recover those funds. And if the sponsored project is not separately incorporated, it's going to be individuals who sign this fiscal sponsorship agreement. And it would be to those individuals that sign the fiscal sponsorship agreement that you would look to recover.
not ideal, but
But it does highlight one of the reasons that we say, again, maybe as lawyers too, it's important to have that fiscal sponsorship agreement and not just allow this to be oral. Although sometimes it starts off that way, but having that actually agreement in place, this is one of the reasons why it's good to have that written agreement in place, and one that's thoughtful too.
Great. Thank you so much. Again, we are grateful to Chapman and Cutler for co-sponsoring this webinar, and especially grateful to you, Rebecca and Paul, for sharing your expertise with all of us. Thanks again. If any of you have questions about fiscal sponsorship agreements or navigating any of these issues, please do submit an inquiry form on our website. We'll put that again in the chat. And we're going to move on to the case study session of our fiscal sponsorship ins and outs today. So a lot of the information that you heard so far is really we really went into depth about the legal issues, and those legal issues cover employment and lobbying and exempt organization compliance and all the other control and decision making issues. And sometimes it's really helpful, while we have the legal perspective and we have a vast network of volunteer lawyers that are willing to help these groups that advance race equity and economic opportunity. Sometimes it's helpful to hear from a nonprofit leader who's kind of navigated this issue in different roles. And so with us today is Alexa Rice-Hedry, who is the former interim operations director for Transformative Justice Law Project, which is an organization of activists, legal workers, and organizers who provide support, legal advocacy, and free criminal legal services to poor and street-based transgender people in Illinois. I'm really excited to have Alexia Rice-Hedry here today because she has more than 10 years in nonprofit management, values-based leadership, and facilitation. She served as the development director at Affinity Community Services in Chicago and as the associate director of the Illinois Safe Schools Alliance. And she has considerable experience in kind of navigating these issues and working with organizations. So Alexia, welcome.
Thank you.
So I would love to have you, I kind of glossed over Transformative Justice Law Project's mission, but can you tell me a little bit more and kind of share with the audience here a little bit more about the organization and kind of how it started?
Yeah, sure. So TJLP was a project started by a group of radical activists, lawyers, social workers, who in about 2008 really saw the need for like holistic criminal legal services for trans and gender nonconforming folks, and really focusing on Black and brown folks, street-based folks, like you said. And so some of the values that guided the work was prison abolition, gender self-determination, and transformative justice, right? And so some of the ways that they started doing that work was one-on-one criminal legal support for folks who are incarcerated or recently out, or trans folks who were on the inside. So for the first couple of years, it was more so independent support or one-on-one support, clemency cases they did a couple of, and different things like that, and then moved into what is the #1 project still, which is the name change mobilization, or the MOBS, right? And so the organization started in around 2008, and the MOBS started in 2011. And so that pre-COVID or pre-pandemic was a once-a-month clinic at the Daily Center where folks could come and get support in getting their name changed, right? So from beginning to end, you had a support person, someone to help you fill out all the forms, someone to go to the court hearing with you, and then kind of support you if need be after that. We also do some advocacy. There are some bills that are in process right now, and then community education. So, going to different law schools in the Chicagoland area, speaking with law students around these issues, going to different organizations as well.
Thanks. And can you tell us a little bit more about when you were conducting conducting or not you specifically, but when the organization was conducting some of the initial activities, who was doing that? Was it volunteers or was that employees of the organization? Because it's been started a long time ago and kind of going through that process. So I'd love to hear a little bit more detail about that.
Yeah, for sure. So for almost a good 10 years, I want to say, it was volunteer led. So there were no paid staff, independent contractors, anything of the sort. And it was a collective model, right? And that was on purpose because they wanted to operate outside of the nonprofit industrial complex, to stay true to the values and to doing the process of the work and not necessarily an end goal, right? Which is tied to a lot of the things when you move into being a formalized organization or 501c3. And so held on to that model of doing things for a good long time. And then I believe around maybe 2017 or so, brought in a lawyer that was an independent contractor to work on some things. Yeah.
So that's actually not unusual to see a loose coalition that really intentionally does not seek formalization of its legal structure, intentionally operates as a loose coalition to advance its mission on either direct services, on grassroots organizing. That's not unusual. Can you tell us more about what was going on in that decision-making process of, either consensus or kind of like that flat structure, and how a little bit more about how that decision-making was made? And then I would love to, after that, go into like, why did this, what led to this change?
Yeah, of course. So I came to the organization in 2018. And so from my understanding before that, and when I originally came in, decisions was made by consent. So consensus. So everyone had to agree upon the projects, what was done, who was getting support. And at that time, they were fiscally sponsored, but it was a very loose fiscal sponsorship agreement, to the point that there was no like financial reporting happening, no information via like 990s or taxes around the organization. So nothing of this sort. But there was a collective of about 4 to 5 people, and it changed over the course of a couple years. And so it got to the point where they were just outgrowing that model, right? For an organization that was volunteer led for so long, it just became time. Folks got tired, burnt out. They wanted to be able to expand services. And like you all mentioned earlier, to start receiving grants, to receive donations, and to build the capacity. And so kind of that led the decision to move into a different fiscal sponsorship, because some folks on the call might be familiar, but there was a fiscal sponsor that they were using that shut down around 2018, 2019, right? And so I was brought in as a consultant to kind of lead them into finding a different fiscal sponsor, but also help with some of the back end things of like building a budget, like knowing exactly what is needed from a fiscal sponsor, navigating that relationship with the fiscal sponsor. And so when I came in at the beginning of 2018, that process took several months to find a fiscal sponsor that we thought aligned with our mission and values and things like that, and could provide the level of back-end support that we needed. I can keep going if you have another question.
Oh no, were there specific criteria that you can see that kind of made the organization and its informal leadership structure kind of say, we really need to move to a more structured relationship with a fiscal sponsor, and kind of what that was. If there's something like, what, this was the turning point, or maybe there was a series of a series of events that kind of made the organization transition to be, like, we need to have a really formal structured relationship with a fiscal sponsor. We need this kind of specific support from a fiscal sponsor, not somebody who's just going to be a fiscal sponsor on paper, but actually that really kind of, providing specific services, and we are talking with them about what we are doing as well.
Yeah, I think the criteria, as I stated, was that there was like very little reporting happening. And so, for example, if they did want to apply for grants or different things, you didn't necessarily have a balance sheet or a profit and loss statement or anything to give that grantor when you were applying, right? And so some of those things, I believe, was like the criteria of, okay, these are things that we need moving forward. If we do have an independent contractor, we need someone to deliver those 1099s, right, to folks, to make sure that these things are getting reported to the proper entities that they need to be reported to, right? And so I think that was kind of the catalyst to move to more formalized, and also to be able to have some support around like forecasting, budgeting, things like that, in order to grow the capacity.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I know that Transformative Justice Law Project has more formally organized and applied for its own 501c3 status, and now has its own 501c3 status. Can you share more about the change from going from a loose fiscal sponsor, the more structured fiscal sponsor relationship, and then ultimately when it's kind of like we're outgrowing even a fiscal sponsor and we need to have our own employees? We can't just deal with a fiscal sponsor that is properly classified as an independent contractor, and we really need to have a more formal structure and be able to raise funds on our own.
Yeah. So I think at the beginning, the move from the loose sponsor to a little more formalized, there was an understanding, there was a contract, as the lawyers spoke about, that the more formal fiscal sponsor would understood that it was a project that it was a kind of independently run project, and they would have control over the funds. It would sit in their bank account. They would do the back end reporting for us and things like that. It became kind of clear or evident sometime into it that that didn't really align with the values that the organization wanted to keep. And so there was some more kind of like formalized control over the way project funds were spent. And so I had some conversations with the fiscal sponsor, and also started to hire folks who were independent contractors under the formalized fiscal sponsor, and started to have more conversations around, is this sustainable? Is this equitable? Having folks pay their own taxes, like making sure they kind of budget that out per quarter or year, thinking about really how it affected everyone in the organization, right? Wanting to accept our own donations. And also a big part of having a fiscal sponsor is they have fees, right? And so those fees could range anywhere from a percentage or a flat rate. And so thinking about what capacity the organization could get to internally without having to pay, portions or pieces of grants that came into another entity. And also just to get back to the value. So it was more so a value misalignment that came up as well. That kind of led the charge into being a formalized C3 and wanting to do it in a different way, right? That was really values aligned. And so wanting to create a flat structure within the organization among staff, like having a board that ran a little bit different than a typical board. So kind of getting back some of the control and some of the process that TJOP was used to was kind of the catalyst to move to become a C3.
Thank you. You had mentioned that it raised some equity issues internally within the organization to have an independent contractor, and then who is also going to be paying self-employment taxes in addition to a bunch of other compliance requirements. So that then takes away the total compensation that this person would be having, because it would be properly classified as an independent contractor, and then knowing that that person would then have to pay taxes on that as well, rather than the employer having full control and making the decisions. And so that I just wanted to kind of go along that line of thinking, because that is something that you're not the first one or the first client that we've ever heard this from, because it is an equity question about that sometimes does help an organization really understand about, have we made our case for sustainability such that we no longer need this fiscal sponsorship? And then what are the things that we need to do to grow and actually internally build the capacity? So thank you so much for bringing that up. I did receive a question in the chat, and I'm going to pose this to you, Alexia, is when you were in the fiscal sponsorship relationship, who managed the benefits of vacation and healthcare? And I'm assuming that this is with an independent contractor relationship, which again goes to the equity question. Do you want to share a little bit more about conversations? Because I think that would be helpful to see how discussions about that would be helpful to see the formalization. Yeah.
So technically, independent contractors don't get any of those things because they're not employees of the organization. So technically, you can't provide health insurance, vacation, things like that, because they're not an employee. They have a end goal, a job, like a specific task that they're there to do. But with TJOP, I created kind of like a contractor manual, just because some of the people were more regular and we knew where we were moving towards. So we kind of had our own process where folks receive some additional stipends to pay for their own health insurance. And then in terms of vacation and things like that, it was basically just conversations with folks about what they needed. But the fiscal sponsor organization had no input, no say in that, because they were not employees of that fiscal sponsor.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your sharing TJLP's story and the internal decision-making process, and really, the fact that it can take a long time for a loosely organized group, even if they've been operating for 10 years, that is okay. That can be an intentional decision. And then there can be points along the way, along an organization or a movement's growth, where it maybe makes sense to have a relationship with a fiscal sponsor, to explore potentially other fiscal sponsors for mission alignment. And also, ultimately, if the case is made for sustainability and those decisions internally with the values of the organization, and you can still have some internal consensus decision-making and flat organizational model, that perhaps even formalizing the structure, creating an organization, creating a corporation with officers and directors, with an executive director or CEO, and with income tax exemption, can still create incredible impact and still have the consensus and lived values that the organization wants to inspire. So again, we are at the end of our time. I want to thank Rebecca Wallenfels, Paul Carmen, and Alexia Rice-Henry for sharing their experience and expertise. I want to thank Woods Fund, Conant Family Foundation, and the Fields Foundation for supporting this educational series, and our pro bono partner, Chapman and Cutler, for co-sponsoring this session on fiscal sponsorships. Upcoming Advocacy by the Book sessions will be on financial management and reporting, and employment law. So look for registration information in your inbox in the coming weeks. The recording of this presentation will be on our YouTube channel in the next few days, so you can review with your own organization, especially if they were unable to attend. Of course, we are here to support you, so please contact us at probonoworks@clccrul.org. Thanks again for joining us today.